So this presentation from the 2023 Virtual Christmas Summit is going to be from Tom Hammond. And the topic is, so you want a show network. Tom?
Yeah, thanks a lot. My name is Tom Hammond. I've been doing lights for about 11 years. And so about what the reason for a show network, we'll talk about that in a bit. We'll also talk about other things like how networks can stuff. So basically, what we do is why have a show network? There can be reasons for and against network. Some people do sneakernet, some people networks, some people will put the show network, same network as their home network. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of those. We'll talk about bandwidth consumption with a PICO, how much it actually takes on your network, how much load it puts on your network for various frames per second, number of pixels.
Tom, let me break in for just a second, man. Your audio is cutting out pretty bad. Maybe you stop the recording, and I'll just be responsible for it.
Okay, let me try that. Okay, is it any better?
Let you know in a second.
Okay.
Keep talking.
Okay. We'll also talk about the protocols and E131, DTP, things like that, and how they affect the bandwidth. We'll also talk about how networks work. So basically, how routers work, proxies, VPNs. Talk about IP addresses. We'll talk about MAC address. How all that kind of stuff comes together. So it's kind of an introductory course about how to get this kind of stuff understood more than anything. And again, we'll talk about routing and proxies and all that kind of stuff. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and present all the content, and we'll have 10 minutes at the end for answers. And, hold on to your questions before we put them in the chat. We'll get those covered, and we'll go from there. So again, I've been doing shows for about 11 years. My first show was with GE Effects. If some of you remember those, I had a line of those around the roof of my house, and I had 5 different strings with 5 different radio RF remote. I think they're radio remotes, trying to set them to the same pattern, and that got old really quick. So second year, went with an Arduino to control them. I had a good friend that helped me get them wired up to run that way. And finally got into X-Lights about, I think, year 3, doing that kind of stuff. So I'm an IT tech for University of Akron. So basically work with computers, been doing networking stuff, computer stuff, makerspace stuff. That's been my latest fun, 3D printers, laser cutters. So quite the hobbyist with all that kind of stuff. My show is sort of 63,000 pixels, but you include the matrices, but I think that's kind of cheating. So if you take my matrix away, which runs off of my Falcon player, direct connect with the HDMI, it's there's really only about 8,000 pixels running through the network during a show. So it's a pretty low pixel count with the network and everything. I have gotten on the news a few times. I was into the internet viewing of my show and also internet control of my show before remote Falcon came on the scene. That got me on TV once or twice, brief flash of fame. But I have my show available on itwinkle.org. If you want to see and hear my control my show every year. This QR code, if you want to take a picture of it with your phones, this will, or you can watch this video that's been recorded for later. This will have a direct link to these PowerPoint slides, among many other types of presentations that have been recorded at various minis I've went to. So if you want to look at these slides again, just take a snap of this QR code, and you can easily get to that and watch it again. I'll just wait just a few seconds. Okay. So that's my show. It's grown over the years. So the latest edition are those P-stake type things. Those are actually really big lights, all those little dots in the yard. So pretty big yard. The only sort of disadvantage to my show is I have to keep most of my props within camera view because I live in a rural area, and I'd like people to be able to see most of my show from within one camera angle. So if you look down near the VCS badge, you'll see a flat looking tree, and I have a camera on that tree pointing towards the house. So most of the props point are within camera view. So that's sort of what I do, but it's certainly grown over the years, and it's a lot of work for one person to set up and tear down every year, but it's a lot of fun. Okay, so what is a show network? Show network is basically you have two separate networks, one for your light show and one for your home network. And a show network is typically physically separated, so you have a router in the middle, but within each show network, they can't really see each other unless the router transfers information back and forth. So a show network could also be SneakerNet, where there's no router in the middle, and you still have two separate networks, and you just take a flash drive or a smart card, memory card, and you transfer sequences back and forth between your home computer and your controllers and Falcon player. So you can do it that way too, but that's a lot of work. So, but basically these networks cannot see each other unless the router, proxy, or VPN allows information to pass back and forth between them. Okay, so why have a show network? What's the importance of a show network? Why are they desired? Well, shows consume a lot of bandwidth. I mean, pixels take a lot of data, and if with your network, you might have your show running, and it just might hesitate on your Ethernet network. Especially if you're running Amazon videos or playing video games, but shows by far take the most bandwidth out of all those. You might also want a show network because the Wi-Fi in your yard is kind of spotty. So the easiest way to solve that problem is you just put another SSD on your Wi-Fi router, and that will typically solve the problem. Third reason is security concerns. It is valid that hackers can get into your home network through your show network. I actually took that risk my first year of doing my remote viewing and control, because I had a homebrew solution that was VBScript PHP, and I had show viewers and controllers coming right into my Raspberry Pi to control the sequences they wanted to play. So I chose to take that risk, and it was pretty foolish. I don't do that anymore. But I took a risk, and you just don't want people coming in, tinkering around and possibly breaking into your home network and doing things. So again, why have a show network? I just told you about the three things I told you are a lie. So I wanted to let you know those aren't necessarily true reasons. First off, bandwidth limitations. Pixel show take a very small fraction of bandwidth, and if you have a 10,000 pixel show, which I'd say probably at least half of our hobbyists have that. They don't go too much over that. You might have 20, 30 to 40,000 pixel shows. They take a little amount of bandwidth on your network to operate. So if you have a gigabit network, it's probably 1% to 2% of the bandwidth to run a 1,000 pixel show with 20 frames. That'd be 40 frames a second. It'd be 2 to 4% of your bandwidth. So minuscule impact on your network. Other home uses, if you have multiple family members watching movies, playing video games, those are fairly low bandwidth too. And we'll get into some of those. We'll talk about do some comparisons, give you an idea. So if you're trying to have a show network, solely because you think that that your network may cause your show to hit and interrupt, it's not very likely. So because again, it doesn't take a whole lot of bandwidth. And we'll talk about home network and the proper gear to use to make sure that that's possible. With Wi-Fi, if you have poor Wi-Fi in your yard, and you're getting kind of spotty access, simply setting up a separate SSID on the same Wi-Fi router will not help anything, because there are other issues. You might have your antenna is not broadcasting in the right location. You don't have the right kind of antenna, the right type of input output from that antenna. It could be a lot of reasons with the radio. You could have interference. So there's other ways to solve that. One common thing is people like to run their shows purely off of Wi-Fi, and there's some really good benefits to that because you don't have to run that Ethernet cable to your controllers in the yard. You still have to run power, but it's fewer cables you have to deal with. But you have to be worried that Wi-Fi can be problematic. You can have things like interference. If you have a lot of people watching your show and they have their phones out and they're trying to get on Wi-Fi or just their own signals, seeking out other access points, it can cause issues with your show hiccuping. It's a better idea to use Wi-Fi on your show instead of transferring pixel data around, to actually just transferring multi-sync packets and just having multiple remote Falcons with copies of your sequence. So it's best to use your Wi-Fi just to keep all of your controllers in sync and have your sequences on the individual controllers. That's a much better use for Wi-Fi. I'm not discounting Wi-Fi for running your pixel data, but if you're wanting to do that, it's important to use good Wi-Fi gear for your network, and we'll touch on that a little bit too. Okay, so security concerns. This is valid no matter what. This is a good valid point for having a show network. You don't want the public getting into your home network. That's absolutely true. But separating your networks, having a show network and a home network, and all the work involved with getting that all set up, it adds, in my opinion, unnecessary complexity. We'll definitely talk about how to do all that with this presentation, but you still have to benefit with all the work involved with the benefits that you're getting. I feel it's more important to improve your home network security. So if you have a pretty beefy home network security system, you're benefiting every member in your family, not just your show. So if you put more work into configuring your router for better security, configuring your firewall for better security, it's not only going to improve your show security, but it's just going to bulletproof your entire network. So that's where you should be putting most of your effort in trying to keep the security risks at bay. Okay, so here's some other reasons that are good to have a show network. If you have wired controllers in the yard and you don't have an easy way to get Ethernet from your house into your yard, your router is on the opposite side of the house, than the front yard, and it's just too much work to get that Ethernet out there. Doing a separate show network is a great idea. And you can use if you have a Falcon player running on a Raspberry Pi or on a BeagleBone as either your master controller or just running your stuff. You can have that Raspberry Pi be a router, and it actually trades information back and forth between the two networks. So the Raspberry Pi in this case would be Wi-Fi to your home network, because Raspberry Pi 3B pluses and higher have Wi-Fi built in. So you'd have your Raspberry Pi talk to your home network with Wi-Fi. And if you look in this diagram, you'll see that the Raspberry Pi in the middle with that little antenna there has two IP addresses. It has a 192 address, which is the same network as your home network. But then it also has a 10.x address for talking to your show network. So it has a foot in the door of both networks. So all your controllers would be hooked up through Ethernet to the Raspberry Pi for that network, and then Wi-Fi would actually get to your home network. So that's a perfect use for getting a show network going and keeping the data separate from each other. So, and if you still want a strong Wi-Fi signal in your yard, you could upgrade your router at home to support a better signal. You could also put in an additional Wi-Fi router on your home network just to talk to the show network. So there's options we'll talk about with that too. Another good reason for having a show network is if you have a really large show. And if we're talking 1 million pixels, or even half of that, you'll need to make sure that your network, the bandwidth for that doesn't get interrupted by things that your family might be doing for what they're up to. So unless you have a really big show, then yeah, a separate show network is a good idea to save on the bandwidth. Okay, so let's talk about bandwidth for a second. Okay, we're going to talk about FPS differences, and that's frames per second, and that's how smoothly your show operates. We're going to talk about protocol differences and how that affects bandwidth. So we have two major protocols that we'll talk about that can make your bandwidth more efficient. And how much, again, we'll touch on how much bandwidth does a show really take on your network, and we'll do some comparisons about different devices on your network. So FPS, most people here know what that means. It's frames per second. That's how many how smooth your pixels update per second. Traditionally, it's been 20 frames per second, and 40 is the more common one right now because it's smoother. Your eye can actually differentiate up to 60 frames per second. So, I run my show at 20, and that's partially because some of my pixels are still the older style that don't update that very fast. And there's nothing wrong with using 40. It will double the bandwidth on your network to do that kind of data pushing through. But for most people shows, that's not really an issue either. So if bandwidth is a concern, going with 20 frames a second would help with the bandwidth, but I don't think you have to do that. I think you can stick with 40. Okay, so we have protocols. Protocols are like languages going through your Ethernet cabling. So it's basically how efficient the languages are. So the two major ones are E131, and that's been the most common one for the lighting community for a number of years. It's called streaming ACN, and we'll talk about more about these protocols in detail in a bit here. But basically, it's the most inefficient for bandwidth for the data going through your cable. There's two ways you can run E131. You can do what's called static universes or auto size universes. And the auto size will save you some bandwidth on your network if you configure your X lights that way and your controllers that way. So we'll talk about that more. Most people are actually moving to a DDP, which is distributed display protocol, which is a more efficient way of getting the same data through the cable. So it's up to 40.5% more efficient at the data. So your data will get to the controllers basically faster. And so you don't have to worry about flooding your network too much. So again, we'll talk about more of these in just a bit here. So again, shows don't consume much bandwidth. If you're talking with a plain E131 protocol, if that's what you've got your X light set up for and your controllers, for suppose your home network is running on a 100 megabit switch, you're only needing about 16 megabits per second out of that 100 to run a 10 show. Or 32, a third of the network, you had a 40 frame show. So I'm talking a lot of bandwidth for a show, but that's a lot of people are running 100 megabit stuff for. So if you're running E131 with the outside universe feature active, it goes to 12.3 megabits. And if you configure your X lights and your controllers to run with the DDP protocol, it drops to 0.5 megabits. So out of a 100 megabit network, it's just a 10% to 20% hit. It's really, really low. And so if you have a gigabit network, which is the more common thing that people have for networks, we're talking 1% of your bandwidth, 4% max for a 10,000 pixel show. So for those that like pictures, there you go. So there's your network in blue, 100 megabit, and there's your bandwidth with the static, the auto size, and the DDP. And if you're running a gigabit network at home, you can see that a 10,000 pixel show is just a drop in the bucket. It just does not take much bandwidth at all. So, and really, if you look at some other things here, your typical network is gigabit, which is 1,000 megabits. If you had a Wi-Fi router, it runs a whole lot faster than your switch does, a Wi-Fi 6 even more. But you got to keep in mind with the Wi-Fi routers, because anything Wi-Fi is affected by all sorts of things going on in the air. So it's affected by the environment, people's phones, other portable devices, if there's RF interference going on around you. So those are just theoretical maximums. Those will fluctuate. That's why it's not the best idea to put pixel data on Wi-Fi, unless you have a Wi-Fi network that's kind of beefy and it's made for that. So there's your pixel show at 9.58 megabits. If you're watching a typical streaming video on your television, it's about 8 megabits. If you're running some 4K video, it's 15. And online game playing is 3 to 10. And if you're actually streaming video games to your console, it's 100 megabits. So if you look at 100 megabit typical home network, with a 100 megabit switch or router, which is not very common. Those are kind of the old devices nowadays. You'll see that your show bandwidth is that blue area, not a very big chunch piece there. And if you happen to be running a pixel show, watching a video, someone else in the house watching at the same time a 4K video, you have a kid playing an online game console, and you have another kid playing a streaming game console, you've still got some bandwidth to spare. So even though your family might be doing a bunch of things on the network with this old-fashioned network, the bandwidth is still not being penalized. Your show will still run well. And if you have a gigabit, router at home or a gigabit switch, and your devices are hooked up through gigabit, the show bandwidth is like minuscule. So it's surprising actually, even if you're doing a lot of things in the house with your network. Okay, let's talk about improved bandwidth. If data coming through, sort of like the how it is organized. Most people in this hobby, pick is divided into verses. At least it used to be typical way in the past. And so if you had a prop that was, a universe might have 512 channels of data, and if a prop that was 512 channels, one packet, imagine a packet like the size of a baseball, fill that packet up with water. So to get that data from excites to your pixels, that one packet of data through your network, and you're done. The problem is if you have props that don't evenly fall into those 512 sections. So if you had a prop that's 750 channels, you actually have to send 2 packets to get that data across. So one packet would be full of data, and the other packet would be half full. So that's 2 baseballs. So, but that second baseball would be half full of water. So you'd be wasting bandwidth because you had to send 2 full packets over. So that's where the universe idea kind of breaks down a little bit, because as things are broken up into those sections, you're sending a lot of packets over, but they're not all very full. So it's a simple way to fix that within Xlights and your controllers. You just enable a feature called auto size, and actually compresses the dead space in those packets, so there's fewer packets that have to be shot over. So in the above example, if you had to send 4 packets over, 4 baseballs, if you turn on auto size, you don't have to send over 3 baseballs to your pixels to get the same data over, and then you're making your network more efficient. So that's an easy way to improve your network bandwidth stuff. Now DDP is better yet. DDP does a couple tricks to make it even more efficient on your network. So imagine that instead of baseballs that you're sending to your pixels, each your pixel data is packed up into a basketball. So you can get a whole lot more pixels in a basketball, and it's traveling the same speed as your baseballs. So in E131, what might take 6 packets of data to get to your pixels might only take 2 packets, going at the same speed with DDP. So that's really a big improvement with getting your data around. Also in DDP, your data is actually a packet is having your pixel data in it. There's a header to help with the network communications and getting around. The header is smaller on DDP, so there's more room for data. It's actually a 23% bandwidth savings per packet. So it's really a no-brainer. So you have to check to make sure that, and obviously Xlights will support it, and the Falcon controllers and all the other controllers mostly support DDP. But if you have some obscure controllers, you may want to just double check and make sure you can turn it on. But that'll certainly make your network much more efficient. So just a quick summary between the 2 protocols. E131 divides channels between the universes into universes, has to section everything off. Each packet is limited to 512 bytes. DDP, no need to divide the channels, and the packets are huge. And so in your network cable, if you're using E131, you're only about 72% efficiency of your data getting from point A to point B. So you're wasting some of your bandwidth with that protocol. With DDP, you're closer to 95% of really using your network bandwidth well. Okay, let's talk about improving your home network. Some easy things to do to help make sure that your your network devices are on gigabit Ethernet. Your Wi-Fi router, if you have any Ethernet switches, if they're on 100 megabit, it's time to throw them out. Okay. You might be surprised though that like the Raspberry Pi 3 and the Falcon V3 and possibly a number of other controllers only have 100 megabit ports on them. So you would think, well, why don't these have gigabit ports? I mean, gigabit's been around forever. Well, the developers realize that pixel data doesn't take a lot of bandwidth. So that's usually why they have 100 megabit ports on them. And that's okay. That's perfectly fine. But just make sure the rest of your house is gigabit to help the rest of the family's data get around really fast. With your Wi-Fi at home, upgrade to a Wi-Fi 6 or a Wi-Fi 5 router. And if you get a feature called MIMO, that stands for multiple in, multiple out. Typical low-end routers have one antenna, or they might have multiple antennas, but they only accept data coming in one direction at once. So data can come in, but data can't leave at the same time. So if you get a router that has MIMO technology, it's got multiple antennas for receiving data and transmitting data at the same time. And that's a fairly simple feature to find in a router nowadays. So get that if your router currently doesn't have it. If you want a really beefy Wi-Fi network at home that's going to run your pixel data, or you just don't want to have any kind of spotty access in the yard, you can get what's called a mesh Wi-Fi system. One brand example of that is called Unify, and it'll do the job extremely well, but you have to really know networking really well to understand how to set them up properly. So that's a great way to get really solid Wi-Fi, but be prepared it's got a high learning curve. And you can also lower your show's frames per second, but I don't really recommend that. I think 40 is fine for most people. Okay, let's talk real quick about how data communication works so we can understand this thing. Data gets the network through something called the model. This is actually 1980, and you have these layers. And with these different layers, I'm going to show you the next slide here. Start with the very basic at the bottom, which is the hardware. So you have Ethernet cable, the radio, and your Wi-Fi router. So this is the hardware level. The next up in transfer data are the protocols. So this is the Ethernet protocol, or the E31 protocol, or the DDP. And you also work something called MAC addresses, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We're not going to cover all these layers in detail, but please start with the hardware at the bottom, all the way to the very top, which is your applications, exploits. So there's different things transferring different layers here. There we go. So you have different things that you've probably seen and heard of, and some of you might understand them, and some of you might not. Okay, because they're pretty confusing. You have what's called a MAC address, MAC, which is Media Access Control, and has a bunch of letters and numbers in it with dashes. You also have something called transmission control, or TCP/IP IP address. So, and that's a different kind of number. So let's talk about those for a minute so we can understand what's going on. So what is a MAC address? A MAC address is basically a serial number for every hardware device in your network. So your Raspberry Pi has a MAC address. Your controllers do, your computer does, your phones, your smart TV, every device has a unique serial number that does not change. It's that way everything stays unique. And in the MAC address, the beginning part of the MAC address, the first 3 sets of hex numbers there, that's a manufacturer ID. And the last 3 sets of characters there is your serial number for your particular device. So that's just something unique that never changes. On the other hand, you have something called a TCP address, TCP/IP address. And basically this is a logical addressing. So if you consider this like a nickname for your device, and those nicknames could change if you want them to. In our hobby, it's best that the nicknames never change. That way, your Falcon player can always find your controllers, and X-Lights can find your controllers. But in this, you have, if you look at the number in green, the first 3 numbers is unique for defining one network. Okay, basically, and the 2 in blue is a unique number for your device, like your printer or your X-Lights controller, or things like that. So you can have from 2 to, I think it's 254 or 253. So you can have up to 253 devices on your network, on that one network that are uniquely defined. So, but you want to keep those numbers the same per device. You don't want them changing. There's different ways to make sure they don't change those, because you don't want a nickname to change to a different nickname. Otherwise, things can't find each other. There are ways to do that. I won't get into that with this talk because I don't have enough time to do it, but it's not hard. The quickest way, I think, to make sure your devices don't change, because sometimes you can get different numbers for your devices, is you go to your router and you set up what's called a DHCP pool. So basically, out of ranges from .2 to .254, you can say, well, I want my DHCP pool to be .2 to 200 or 150. That means that all the family members in your house will get sometimes changing the IP addresses, which is fine, but you put all of your controllers and all your show stuff on anything above 150 or 200 outside the DHCP pool. So once you define those numbers on your network in your devices, nothing in the home environment is going to interfere with those. So that's probably the simplest way to do it. So again, we just talked about that IP address. The first part, the green part of the address, is actually your unique number for your home network or your show network, and the last number is unique for each device on your network. Okay, real quick, let's talk about switches and hubs. I'm not sure how many of you still remember what hubs are. Okay, that's kind of an old technology. So let's talk about switches first. Your router, your Wi-Fi router at home, it has a switch built in. You can also buy switches that are dedicated, that you just plug your different networking devices in. So both, you can buy them independent or built into your Wi-Fi. This is how different devices on your network can see each other and find each other and transfer data. So a switch basically looks at when you have all your stuff plugged into your switch, your different devices, the switch will actually probe your network and find the MAC address or the serial number of every device you have. So it knows what's where, and what's around. And as you start transferring data from one device to another, the switch learns, the switch initially takes the data from where it's sending it and blasts it to all the devices on the network. And that's not very efficient, because you'll have some devices receiving data that don't need it. But what happens is the device that returns back to the switch and says, this was really for me, the switch learns about that, and that's called setting up an ARP table. So the switch eventually learns which device needs to receive which data. So when you have X-Lite sending data to your controller, instead of blasting it to the whole network, the switch will eventually realize on its own that it needs to go to one particular device and only that device, and it makes your network more efficient. So the trick with switches is it learns the network, it floods your data to all the devices on the network temporarily until it learns what's responding, and then when it gets smart, it only forwards the data to the correct device, which cuts down on flooding your network with unnecessary data. So that's how switches work. Hubs aren't smart at all. They just, when data comes into a hub that needs to go to another device, it blasts it to all the other devices in the network. And so devices that don't need to receive it will still receive it, and that just slows down your whole network. So the summary of this is, if you have a 100 megabit switch or even a 100 megabit Wi-Fi router that you're plugging some Ethernet devices in, it's time to upgrade, because that stuff's just not good for your network. If it's a 100 megabit switch and not a hub, that's a compromise. That's okay. But really, it'd be time to get everything upgraded to a gigabit switch as much as you can. Okay, how do you set up a show network if we want to do this? So basically, again, it's creating a connection between a home and a show network so data can pass to and from. There are 3 different methods to connecting 2 different networks together. You have something called routing, you have something called a proxy, and a VLAN. So different methods to do basically the same idea, but there's pros and cons to these methods. So what is routing? Routing selects a path for data within a network or between multiple networks. So it basically helps data from one network get to another network. So if you have X-Lites running on your home network and you want to send the sequence to one of your controllers and store it there, which is on a different network, you have to set up what's called a routing path to help that data leave your network to get to the other network. So so there's a way to do that, and it's not hard. It's actually very easy to set this up. So now a proxy, on the other hand, and let me go back with the routing. Your Raspberry Pi will be the traffic cop, and it will intercept the data and then send it off to the correct device on the other network. Now, a proxy, on the other hand, is similar idea. The Raspberry Pi is still pulling the data from the home network and sending it off to the show network, but it does it in a different way. And a proxy works at what's called the application level of the OSI model, which is a bit more work and to set up. And the problem with the proxy is when the destination device, like your router, your light controller, receives the data, it thinks the data came from the middleman, the Raspberry Pi. It did not know that it came from X-Lights. So basically, all your devices on the show network will think that everything came from the Raspberry Pi, when in fact you might have sent it from your X-Lights computer, and that can give you a couple issues. So with a proxy, your show network cannot easily see your home network. So that's the biggest problem with a proxy. So if you have a controller and you want to grab like the time off of the internet, with a proxy, you can't do that quite easily. So that's one thing to worry about. And we'll talk about that some more. So again, with routing, routing is somewhat easy to set up because you don't have to configure X-Lights, the application, to set up routing. With routing, both devices on either network can access the internet to get the date and time. They can see each other on between networks, which is kind of nice. The only con with the routing solution is it's a little bit tricky to set up because you have to modify the operating system of your X-Lights laptop or computer. You have to issue a command that tells your home computer or laptop how to find your devices on your other network, on your show network. So you have to define a routing path. And once you've issued that command and told your computer how to do it, you do it once for the most part, and it knows how to do it the rest of it, the rest of its life, until Windows crashes. So it's actually pretty easy to set up. Now, the proxy, you don't need to mess with your computer's operating system and set up a routing path. So in that way, it's kind of nice. But the problem with a proxy setup is on your show network, you have to define the proxy settings on every device on your show network. So your controller, every controller has to be configured for the proxy. Your Falcon Pi player software has to be configured for the proxy. So you have to touch every one of those devices and make sure they're set up properly. So it's more work this way. And the other problem with a proxy is it's only one way. So show devices like your light controllers, other than the master Falcon Pi player, which is acting as the middleman, cannot see the internet for date and time. So if you went with a proxy solution, you might have to get like battery real-time clocks for your controllers to make sure they keep their date and time, things like that. So there's pros and cons. So we talked about router here. So basically, that picture there on the right, and that's your Raspberry Pi that's doing the routing. All the on the right with all the data packets through, and red star X-Lights packet that needs to get to show network. So the router knows that every time it's a red star, it passes on, in this case, through an Ethernet cable to all of your show devices from that switch on the left. So it lets the packets through that need to get to that other network. That's what routing does. Okay. Routers are based on destination's IP address. So basically, it uses the nickname system to get data from one to another. And as we mentioned before, your Raspberry Pi, when you turn it into a router, it will have two IP addresses assigned to it. So the Wi-Fi antenna of your Raspberry Pi, this is just one idea. There's many different ways to do routing, and we'll talk about one other way to do it too. But if you do it with your Raspberry Pi, the Wi-Fi connection will have it connect your home network with the IP address of your home network. And then the Ethernet port on your Raspberry Pi will have the IP address that represents your show network. So it can pass things back and forth. Okay, and this is another explanation how it does it. So if your home network is 192.168.1, that's the IP address of your home network. All the devices have that same IP address except the last octet, I think. That's the unique number for each device. And then on the show network, you have the 10.1.1, and these are arbitrary. You can make up these numbers within reason. There's limitations to what numbers you can use, but they don't have to be exactly those numbers. But it just tells how to get things back and forth. Okay, how do we set up routing? How do we make this actually work? We're not going to do a demo because we only have, not a whole lot of time to cover this, but it's actually very easy, relatively speaking. Basically, what you have to do first is you enable on your Falcon Pi Player software, you enable the routing feature, and you're practically done. Okay, and you have to set up those two IP addresses, right? You have to set up your home network IP address on the Wi-Fi and your show network IP on the Ethernet. And then on your computer side of things, this is your computer that's on your home network where you make all your sequences. You have to do something called defining a static route. And so that helps your home computer find your show network. Okay, so the home computer that's on the home network, it helps that computer or laptop find and send information to devices on your show network. If you don't want to use the Raspberry Pi feature as your router, you can actually buy a router that has routing capability. That's kind of a duplicate way to say things. But if you don't want to use a Raspberry Pi and you do want to just use a regular router to do the routing, make sure that the router that you buy or have supports something called static routes. And that's how you can, so if you do it that way, you don't need to mess with your computer at all, if you just get a dedicated router for this. Now, in FPP, to actually turn on routing, you go to the status control menu, click on network, and then you go to advanced interface settings. And then within that, there's a section called IP forwarding, and then basically you turn it on. You just set IP forwarding to the forwarding option, and you're ready to rock and roll. On your computer, if you're not using a dedicated router and you want your computer to find, find the other network, in Windows, you open up a command prompt and you issue this command. It says route space add, and then you put in your show network's IP address. Remember that was the 1.1.0, right? As the first number, and then you put in the word mask and then space. And then you put in that number that says 255s with all the zeros. I'm not going to explain how that works, but just take it for granted. You got to put that in. Then after that, you put in the IP address of your Raspberry Pi for its Wi-Fi connection. So that's your home network's IP address. So basically, you put route add, and then you put the IP address of your show network, then the word mask, then that 255 number, and then the IP address of your Raspberry Pi it's using on your home network. And then after that, you put a -P, which makes that setting persistent. It makes it remember it. So even when you reboot your computer, it'll still remember that route. And at that point, X-Bytes will be able to find your show network. If you have a Mac and you want to do the same thing, it's also very easy. You just open up a terminal and you type in that sudo command. But the only problem with the sudo command is it's not persistent. So you have to either enter that command every time you boot up your Mac, or you put that into a script that runs every time you boot your machine. And that's pretty easy to do nowadays. So just keep in mind that the sudo command is not persistent. You have to find a way to make it type that in every time you turn on your computer to set up that static route. Okay, again, if you don't want to mess with tweaking your computer and entering those commands, get a dedicated router that supports a feature called static routes. Your basic Wi-Fi router that you have at home, or if you have your own dedicated router, if it's home equipment, it probably won't let you do a static route. But there's a feature that if you're a little bit adventurous, you can actually upgrade older routers and sometimes newer routers to support advanced features through a third-party firmware upgrade. So it's called DD-WRT. And so basically, if you buy like a Linksys router, a home router, and it does not support static routes, you can go to that website, and if they list your router as supporting this DD-WRT firmware, you can actually replace the Linksys firmware with generic firmware written by a third party. And if you're comfortable with that idea, okay, you'll get all sorts of cool features that normally your router was not allowed to do, and including static routes and some other cool things like setting up bridges and Wi-Fi extenders and all that. So you do run the risk if you mess it up, you could actually brick your router and you may not be able to use it ever again. But a lot of people do this DD-WRT and get some really cool functionality out of their existing routers. I've done it a couple times and love it. So it's worth the risk if you feel adventurous. If you don't, then just buy a dedicated router that supports that static route. Okay, we're not going to talk about proxy a whole lot because I'm not too thrilled about it overall. But basically what happens is when you send data from your home network, like from X-Sites, the data is sent from X-Sites to the Raspberry Pi, which is acting as the mediator. And then the Raspberry Pi sends it off to the show network. So it's sort of like routing, right? But the problem is the Raspberry Pi is originating the data from that point forward to your controllers. So the controllers can't talk back to your X-Lights if they need to, and they can't see anything on your home network. So none of your show network devices can get onto basically the internet if you go with a proxy solution. It's easy to set up. I mean, Falcon Pi Player has a proxy feature built into it to set it up. I'm not going to explain that here. Your controllers are likely to have proxy functionality. You just put that in there, but you do have to configure every one of your show devices to support the proxy method. This is how you do it, but in the interest of time, I think we're gonna. Basically what you have to do is in your master Falcon player that's controlling your show network, you have to define the IP address of all of your controllers, so the Falcon player knows where to send all the data to once it receives it from X-Lights. So, and then you have to go to every controller and turn on proxy mode too. So, okay, let's talk just really briefly about the third method to doing a show network, and this is called virtual private network, or VPN. Basically, VPNs can be used for a lot of things, but what they're commonly known for is they form separate networks within the same switch. So instead of having your Raspberry Pi as a mediator between two networks, you might have your show devices plugged in to the same switch that your home devices are plugged into. And you can actually separate your networks based through software that you set up within the switches, the interface. So they act like separate networks, and the stuff can't get back and forth between the two networks unless you're using certain paths to make that possible. So imagine it like it's like a router, but all your stuff is plugging into the same device. It's like a virtual router kind of thing. So you need kind of an enterprise level switch to do a VLAN, or did I say virtual private network? Yeah, I have my terminology messed up. So VLAN is what I meant to say. That's virtual LANs. Yeah, sorry about that. I still got to fix my slides. So VPNs. I mean, if you've got a switch that can support that functionality, is it worth it? Probably not. It's overcomplicating things. I mean, it's almost like you're doing too much work, and it's not really worth all that effort. I mean, there's better things you could be spending your time on. But that's how they work, and so this is the method I certainly wouldn't recommend unless you're into this kind of stuff and you just want to do it because it's a fun hobby, just like all this kind of stuff is. So for the talk today, just the takeaways from what we talked about. Shows consume very minimal bandwidth, especially if you're running a gigabit network at home, and also if you're running DDP as your protocol for your pixel data. So having a separate show network, if you're worried about the bandwidth, like if you don't want your family members with all the things they're doing on the internet or within your own house on your network, causing your show to be interrupted, it's really not founded. It's really not going to cause an issue. The bandwidth of a show takes so little space on a modern network nowadays. So the bandwidth is really not an issue. Don't overcomplicate things. I mean, don't try to if you really don't need a separate show network, you're just adding a lot of complication to something that's really not necessary. Again, with your network, if you're worried about security and you want your stuff on a separate network, that's okay. I mean, you can do it, but why try to build a beefy show network that's very secure and very safe when your home network for the family is not well built and not as safe? I mean, who needs to be protected more? And if you work on your router configuration and your firewall settings for the router and all that kind of stuff for your home network, your show network, your show pixel show will also be safe. It's running on the same network. So you're actually doing the best of both worlds good by improving just your one network. If you have any 100 megabit switches, toss them. If your Wi-Fi router doesn't have gigabit ports on it, your Wi-Fi router, it's probably time to upgrade to a better router if you have multiple devices for that router on each. So top 100 megabits the door. Believe it or not, I mean, my little show, it's only 10,000 pixels. Okay, I thought it was running 100 megabit. I think I am on gigabit for some of my now. So if you do want to have a separate network, the very simple way to make that work is to set up routing and use the Wi-Fi in your Raspberry Pi to join your networks together. Again, if you have a Raspberry Pi 3, I think the 3V Plus has Wi-Fi, but I think the regular 3, maybe the Raspberry Pi, definitely the Raspberry Pi 2, those don't have Wi-Fi by default unless you add an adapter. So if you've got a Raspberry Pi 3V Plus or a 4, you're good to go. And you might want to add a Wi-Fi antenna just to make sure your Raspberry Pi can see your home network easily. But that's the best way to set up routing between two different networks. Especially if you have controllers out there that are out in the yard and you don't want to run Ethernet from inside the house to those controllers. Get your Raspberry Pi out in the yard, Wi-Fi it into your home network, and then plug in everything on the controller side of things to Ethernet on the other side of the Pi. So an overall routing is better set up and more effective of what you're getting out of it than setting up a proxy. So with that, I amazingly got most of my stuff talked about within 50 minutes. So if you want to know more about this kind of stuff, there's an excellent networking video that explains this stuff in more detail that was actually talked about during the Christmas Summit in 2021. So you can either snap that link there with your phone. It looks like that K, and then there's a letter J, and then the number 2 in that link. That's a J in there. But again, if you download these PowerPoint slides, you can get to this slide and click on that link directly if you want to. And then if you want to know more about just how E131 controller networking works, it's a good primer on this kind of stuff. There's a YouTube link down there. So any questions about this stuff? Feel free to unmute and tell me. I'll see if I can review the chat window.
I have a question for you. Currently I have a show network set up, but I want to switch it over to just including it on my home network. And I have IP addresses on my 4 controllers. Am I going to have to change those?
Yeah, if you have a separate show network, then you have IP addresses that are different than your home network. So do you remember on the IP address you have 4 what's called octets. You have 4 sets of numbers. So those first 3 numbers have to be the same first 3 numbers on your home network. Okay, so if your show devices have the first 3 numbers of the IP address are different than the IP addresses on your home network, you need to change those IP addresses on your show network. So, and there's 2 ways that people that do it. There's 3 ways, and one way is the wrong way. What you don't want to do is set up your show devices on DHCP, and that means when you plug it into your home network, the home network will assign a temporary unique IP address for that show device, but that could change from time to time. Your router at home could actually give a different number from time to time, and then things can't find each other. So what I would recommend again is on your home router, you go into the router's web interface, you set up something called a DHCP pool, and there should be a pool already defined. The pool might be your network .2 through it might be like .254. That might be the pool that it defaults to, which means any device can get any of those 2 to 254 numbers as its IP address. Well, if you make the pool smaller, like from .2 to in my case, I went to .199, then all of your home devices, all of your home users on their phones, on their TVs, they'll get an automatic number from 2 to 199. But then on your show devices, you just go into its web interface and you set up you define your own IP address. So it'll be your network.200, and at that point, that will always never be touched by other devices in the DHCP pool because it's outside the pool. So and if you do it, see, some people like to define their IP addresses with what's called DHCP reservations. So if you had like a Falcon controller and it had a MAC address that the MAC address because it tells you what it is, that's the serial number built into the hardware. But you can go into your router and say, whenever it sees this MAC address on the network, always give it this one number, okay? And don't ever give it any other number, and don't let other devices take over that number. That method works too, but that's a pain because you got to go into your router and define all these MAC addresses and all the IP addresses that need to be related to them. I find it's far easier just to set up a DHCP pool and then purposely set your show devices IP addresses outside of that pool, within the UI of the controller. Does that make sense?
Yep, that should pretty much take care of it. Thanks so much for clarifying.
Yep, you're welcome.
Hey, Tom, good presentation. Brief comment on the Raspberry Pis. So Raspberry Pi 3B and the 3B Plus both have integrated Wi-Fi. The Pi 2 did not, but any Pi 3 or newer does have integrated Wi-Fi. Just a point of clarity if you want.
Yeah, thank you. And if you're doing if you do want to have a separate show network and you want to put to use your Raspberry Pi as the router to connect your two networks, typically what you'd probably want to do is you have your Raspberry Pi out in the yard because you want your all your controllers that are on Ethernet, you plug them all into a switch, and the switch plugs into the Ethernet port of the Raspberry Pi. And then the Pi has to be able to see your home network through Wi-Fi at that point. So that little tiny antenna on the Raspberry Pi might struggle to get to your home network if it's out in the yard. So it might be wise to get an external Wi-Fi antenna that plugs in through a USB port on the Pi, just to help give it a nice strong connection to your Wi-Fi network. Yeah, I'm trying to catch through the chats here if anyone had other questions.
Yeah, I think some of us have been pretty good about keeping it up, but certainly walk through that and answer anything you think we didn't answer well for you. I will make another comment if I may. For those who are highly interested in the proxy configuration, we did cover that in the FEP advanced class this morning. So feel free to review that session as well once it's recorded and posted. So we did cover proxy specifically, and we kind of skipped over routing, but thankfully you covered the routing in detail, which I kind of figured you would. So great job on that.
And just in a quick minute, can you tell the group here what the main benefits of proxies would be?
Just not having to configure static routing. And if you do a static route on your PC, your controllers on the show network may not actually be able to reach the internet. But if you do configure static routing on your router, which is what I presume you probably do, then yes, they have direct access to the internet and back. But if you configure the static route on your PC only, there's no route back from the internet to your show network that your home router would know about. So, but your controllers on a show network rarely would really need to get to the internet anyway. So it's kind of moot. Personally, I think they're both pretty easy to configure, but for a person that does not understand networking, proxy may be a little bit easier for them to understand and configure because it's all done in Xlights and FPP. And I don't mean to hijack here, but I appreciate the opportunity to give my opinion on the matter. And it is just that. They're both excellent methods to accomplish a separate show network if you feel you need a separate show network.
Yeah, as long as you know the pluses and minuses of each method, because there's pros and cons to both methods. That's the big thing. So you choose the right thing from the get-go. And that was my dog shaking his head.
All right, well, guys, I appreciate the call, Tom. That was a fantastic overview of routing and networks and shows. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And if we have other questions, we can keep the discussion going.